I'm 86 years old, and the reason I still drive myself to the store, cook my own meals, and live alone without a single daily medication is not genetics. It's the way I was taught to eat before the food industry existed to tell us anything different. Most people believe that independence in old age comes down to luck. Good genes, they say, or just staying active. But I've watched people with better genes than mine lose their mobility in their 60s. I've watched active people collapse under the weight of metabolic disease before 70. And I've come to understand something that took me decades to fully see. The body you live in at 80 is the body you built with your fork, decade by decade, starting long before you ever thought about aging. The first thing my grandmother taught me, and she was a woman who lived to 94 without ever seeing the inside of a hospital, was that food was not entertainment. That sounds harsh by today's standards, but what she meant was deeper than it sounds. She meant that the body has a conversation with what you eat, a constant cellular conversation. And the question is not whether that conversation is happening. It always is. The question is what that conversation is saying. When you treat food as entertainment, as comfort, as reward, you stop listening to the conversation. You stop hearing what your body is actually asking for. And over decades, that silence becomes disease. What I ate growing up was built around the rhythm of hunger. We ate when we were hungry. We stopped when we were full. That's not a diet philosophy. That's a biological truth that somewhere along the way got buried under snack schedules and meal timing apps and the idea that you should eat every 2 to 3 hours to keep your metabolism going. That idea is not ancient. It was invented. The reality is that the body is extraordinarily capable of managing its own energy when you stop overriding it. The metabolic flexibility that allows me at 86 to skip a meal without crashing, to feel clear-headed in the morning before I've eaten anything, that flexibility was built by decades of listening to hunger instead of the clock. And here's what most people miss about hunger. There are different kinds. There's the hunger that comes from an empty stomach, a clean physical sensation that arrives naturally a few hours after a proper meal. And then there is the hunger that comes from blood sugar instability, from the crash that follows a spike, from the body desperately asking for more fuel because it burned through a flood of sugar in an hour. Those feel almost identical from the inside, but they are completely different biological events. One is the body communicating readiness. The other is the body in distress, learning to tell them apart. That was one of the most important skills I ever developed, though I didn't have those words for it as a child. I just knew that certain foods left me restless and reaching for more an hour later, and I learned to eat less of those. The foods I grew up on were almost entirely unprocessed. Not because we were disciplined or ideologically committed to anything, because that was simply what food was. Beans cut from dry, eggs from chickens we knew by name, vegetables that came out of the ground days, sometimes hours before we ate them, bread that my grandmother made herself that went stale within 2 days because there was nothing in it to slow that process. And that bread, that naturally fermenting, coarse, dense bread made from flour that still contained the bran and the germ, that bread fed something in the gut that modern bread cannot touch. What we now call the microbiome, that vast internal ecosystem of bacteria that governs inflammation, immunity, mood, and metabolic function, we fed it without knowing we were feeding it. We fed it fiber, real fiber, not fiber supplements, not fiber added back into products after being stripped out, fiber that was never removed in the first place, still embedded in the food the way nature arranged it. But it goes even deeper than that. The fiber is not just food for gut bacteria. The fiber changes the rate at which everything else in that meal enters your blood. It slows the digestion of carbohydrates. It blunts the glucose response. It means that a meal built around whole food, even a starchy, carbohydrate-rich meal, does something entirely different in the body than a meal of equal calories built around refined food. The grain that still has its hull, its bran, its fiber intact, is not the same food as the grain that has been stripped down to white starch. They share a name. They share nothing else biologically. And eating mostly the intact version for 86 years has meant that my insulin sensitivity, the cornerstone of metabolic health, and the thing that most directly predicts how well the body ages, has stayed functional in a way that is apparently unusual for someone my age. We drank water, almost exclusively water. Sometimes coffee in the morning, real coffee, black, because that was how coffee was. Occasionally a small glass of wine with a meal in the European tradition. But water was the default. Always water. This sounds so obvious it barely seems worth saying, until you realize that in modern life, Water has been almost entirely displaced by beverages that carry either sugar or artificial chemistry or both. What that displacement does over lifetime is not subtle. The liver, which is responsible for processing everything that enters the blood from the digestive tract, handles water freely. It handles plain coffee freely. It handles a glass of wine occasionally. It does not handle a daily stream of high fructose corn syrup freely. The liver metabolizes fructose the way it metabolizes alcohol, directly, completely, without passing it to other tissues first. A lifetime of sweetened drinks is a lifetime of quiet, cumulative liver work that slowly degrades metabolic function. I didn't know the biochemistry, but I drank water, and decades later, I'm still here. The real power, though, and this is where it gets interesting, is in what I didn't eat between meals. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The kitchen closed after dinner, and it did not open again until morning. There was no concept of a bedtime snack, no bowl of cereal at 10 o'clock at night, no reaching into the refrigerator out of boredom. Food happened at meal times, and the long hours between meals, and particularly the long overnight fast, were simply the normal rhythm of life. What I understand now is that those overnight hours, those 10 to 12 hours of not eating, were the time my body spent on repair. The cellular cleanup process called autophagy, the recycling of damaged proteins and worn cellular machinery, this process is suppressed by eating. It requires a fasted state to run properly. Feeding constantly, as modern life encourages, means that this repair work never quite gets done. The biological maintenance falls behind, and that backlog shows up in the body as accelerated aging, as chronic low-grade inflammation, as the slow loss of function that most people mistake for inevitable decline. There's nothing inevitable about it. That is what I want you to understand. The decline is not something that simply happens to the body with the passage of time. The decline is built, it is assembled, meal by meal, over years, and it can, to a significant degree, be unmade by the same mechanism. Not reversed completely, I'm not claiming that, but slowed dramatically, and in some cases, functions that seemed lost can actually return when you stop doing the things that suppressed them. What I ate was also cooked. This seems like an unremarkable statement, but it has remarkable implications. We ate almost nothing raw except fruit and the occasional salad. Vegetables were cooked, legumes were cooked for hours, grains were cooked and often fermented in the cooking process. And cooking does something to food that is easy to underestimate. It breaks down anti-nutrients, the compounds in plant foods that bind minerals and make them unavailable to the body, or that irritate the gut lining when consumed in quantity. Traditional food preparation, the long soaking and slow cooking, the fermentation, the practices that modern convenience food has entirely abandoned, those methods made the nutrients in food actually accessible. You could eat the same ingredients in a raw, unprocessed, fast-prepared form and absorb a fraction of the minerals, a fraction of the protein, and carry a higher inflammatory load in the process. The wisdom of traditional food preparation is nutritional, even though the people practicing it had no nutritional science. They had thousands of years of observation about what kept people well. Every meal had protein at its center, not large quantities, not the enormous portions of meat that modern diet culture sometimes celebrates, but protein was always present. An egg, a small amount of meat or fish, beans and legumes, which provided protein alongside all of that fiber. Protein at every meal does something that matters enormously across a lifetime. It preserves muscle. Muscle is not just about strength, though strength matters. Muscle is metabolically active tissue. It is the primary site of glucose disposal in the body, meaning that strong muscles absorb blood sugar efficiently and reduce the burden on insulin. Muscle produces signaling molecules that communicate with the brain, the heart, the bones. Muscle is essentially the organ of healthy aging, and it is built and maintained by protein day after day, meal after meal, across decades. The connection to independence is direct and it is physical. I carry my own groceries, I get up from chairs without using my arms to push, I climb stairs, I open jars. None of this is exceptional for a person of 40. For a person of 86, it is apparently unusual enough that people regularly ask me what I do, and the answer is that I do what I have always done. I eat food that is close to the way it came out of the ground or out of the animal. I eat at meals and not between them. I drink water. I never confuse convenience with nourishment. I listen to the hunger that comes from an empty stomach, and I have no relationship with the hunger that comes from a blood sugar crash because I rarely create the conditions for one. The application of all of this is not complicated. You do not need a program. You do not need to count anything. You need to eat food that still looks like food, food that your great grandmother would have recognized as food. You need to eat at meals and let your body fast between them, especially overnight, and especially for long enough that repair work can actually happen. You need protein at every meal, not in enormous quantities, but present. You need to cook things. You need to drink water as your primary beverage. And you need to understand that the body keeps score of every single thing you put into it, that the account never closes, that it is never too late to start making different deposits, but also that the deposits you make today are the body you'll be living in at 80. There's one more thing, and I want to say it carefully because it is the piece that ties everything else together. Food is information. Every single bite you take is a message delivered to your cells, to your hormones, to your gene expression. The science of epigenetics has established that the food you eat can turn genes on or off, that the same genetic blueprint produces wildly different outcomes depending on the nutritional environment that surrounds it. This means that even if aging poorly runs in your family, you are not sentenced to that outcome. You're influenced by it, yes, but you're not controlled by it. What you eat speaks louder than what you inherited. The people in my life who aged fastest, who lost function earliest, who needed the most help in their later years, they were not the people with the worst genes. They were the people who ate the most processed food, the most sweetened food, the most food that came from a package rather than from a field. The habits I carry from my youth are not nostalgic to me. I don't hold on to them because they remind me of my grandmother's kitchen, though they do. I hold on to them because they work, because 86 years of evidence has played out in my body in real time, and I'm still reading the results, still standing, still thinking clearly, still here. I'm still here, fully here, and I'm telling you that what I've described is not a secret. It is the oldest knowledge in the world. We simply forgot it, or we were convinced to forget it by people who profited from the forgetting. The remembering is yours to do, and the time to start is not when you get the diagnosis. The time is always, and it is always now.